Governor Daniels is ecstatic about the I69 corridor.
This is not the future of transportation in Indiana. This is a dinosaur.
This is something that should have been resolved 10 or 15 years ago.
It's all about the highway.
Port Huron to Laredo, Texas, the NAFTA highway.
One thing about Governor Daniels, if he tells you he's going to do something, he's going to do it.
This is a very significant connecting route all the way through Michigan, all the way through Texas. And it's now, there are parts that aren't completed, and probably the most notable parts not completed is the chunk in Indiana. Connecting a part of the country that has a lot of natural resources, a lot of growth with the old industrial part of the country, I think it'd be very positive.
It's not about building a road, or it's about the overall benefit to the state. The I-69 corridor is important to NDOT because we need to strengthen and enhance the transportation system here in southwestern Indiana. Each corner of the state has its own direct route to Indianapolis, and we're missing that in southwestern Indiana. So it's vital that we do have that connection. Studies have shown over and over that a strong transportation system is vital to economic development.
Clearly the route of I-69 is going through an area that I think can be best described in the state as depressed. I-69 could be a nice boost opening up these areas. I-69 really will lower transportation costs and make some of those towns, whether it's English or Paoli, much more accessible to the rest of the state and rest of the country.
100 years ago, we had the B&O Railroad come through Washington. It was a bustling community, and we had all kinds of factories and so forth. But as you know, the trucking industry has taken that rail yard mentality off the rails. Now it's on the highways. So we're looking at bringing more traffic back within the city limits of Washington, Indiana. We would think at least 40 to 50% growth over the next 20 years.
Bloomington, which is not on an interstate highway, Jasper, Indiana, in Dubois County, and Warsaw, Indiana, they're all remote from interstates, and they all have thriving industrial manufacturing sectors. Compared to the rest of the state, far more thriving, including the communities that are right on interstates.
Pretty much the interstate system was built out in the mid-1970s. After that, any economic gain from new interstate construction would show a negative return. Investments in maintenance and upgrades of existing infrastructure have the highest return of a ratio of 35:1.
We are CAR, Citizens for Appropriate Rural Roads. We are for that. We're not opposed to all roads.
CAR started in this neighborhood, as it were, in summer of 1990. Several families got together, and this is on the heels of hearing that the state was going to be resurrecting the notion of building I-69. So we said, we've got to begin to look into this.
We'd all heard about the highway, and we decided that it was time to maybe get together and try to see if we could do something about it.
The days of creating interstate highways and having factories sprout up alongside it, those days are gone. The reality is we can't keep up with sustainability of the roads and bridges we have now.
As far as looking at job creation in Washington, Indiana, and Davis County off of I-69, that's going to be up to corporate America. They need to invest in southern Indiana and give us a chance. We can deliver.
Economic activity is going to move from where it is now to the new highway. So there's no real gain of economic development, it's just moving it. And it's moving it at the taxpayer's expense.
In fact, they have a term for that. It's called the transfer effect. There isn't going to be a whole lot of new jobs created. They're just going to move them around. And that, to us, is a waste.
There is certainly diversion effects, but I think I-69 is quite different than opening up another Walmart in a county or opening another restaurant, which essentially is basically going to move people around.
We need jobs in Washington, Indiana. We all understand that to be able to have those jobs, we need to have transportation. We need to have the accessibility to interstate highways.
Bloomington, Evansville, and Indianapolis, the three main points on the proposed interstate, were number 1, 2, and 3 in the lowest unemployment in the state. One of the main justifications for the highway was to create job growth in the most economically depressed area of the state. But in the analysis of the numbers, in terms of wage growth, unemployment data, etc., shows the Southwest Quadrant is the highest or one of the highest in the state.
To try to legitimize this project by saying it means jobs or will keep jobs is completely disingenuous, and it cannot be backed up. I would challenge any of these guys to a public debate, when we have for many, many years.
The focus as we've designed the corridor is to lessen the impacts, whether it be wetlands, forestation, or homes or businesses. We've tried to maintain minimal impacts as possible. Of course, there are going to be impacts, and with that, we've tried to mitigate that on a 3-to-1 basis. So what that means is for every acre of wetlands that we are impacting with this new road, we are placing back 3 new acres in an offset location, so that way the habitat can then move to this new location. And with this corridor, we're putting that out in front, so the habitat actually moves to their new location before construction even begins, and they're not disturbed during construction.
We are sitting on karst terrain right here. This whole area is karst, and that means there's a lot of sinkholes and caves and underground streams and so on. If you have a spill into a karst area, it can get into the underground water supply. We have a well here. It could seriously impact our well.
You know, the area is like a sponge. We don't have the surface water of rivers and streams carrying the water. All the drainage is underground. So anything that's spilled on the surface, getting into a sinkhole, is immediately transported underground through this piping network. Any adverse impact into this area is a disaster. It will be immediate and it will be permanent.
It's not just about saving some trees or wetlands or farms, or hundreds of families, over 100 businesses that would have to move. So when I hear judgments made by people like it isn't pristine land, it's just some soybean fields, it's just a few, you know, I completely scoff at that. I consider this pretty pristine land, the place I live. People drive through and they don't think of these kind of areas as community. They just see these kind of scattered farmhouses. But I can go miles in either direction, and I can be at families' houses that I've helped them put up hay. The kids may have gone to school together, played soccer together, et cetera, et cetera.
We've lived here a long time, and we're very blessed to have this lovely place to live. Now, for farm families, that's not just their home and their history and their heritage, it's their income. And typically through this whole project, the impacts on farming and agriculture have just not been seriously considered.
There's no question that a highway will cause changes and disruptions, gains and losses. And some of the history of highways that go through the middle of, whether it's Indianapolis or Chicago or Columbus or Los Angeles, really can destroy the kind of structure of a neighborhood that may have existed there for 100 years. This is not what we're talking about. There's no population density. The disruptive effect to me is insignificant. And don't forget, government does not take the land, the government buys the land. What often isn't mentioned in some of these analyses, people that live near an interchange are quickly going to see a pretty high increase in the value of any property that they may own.
I've talked to farmers now down in sections 2 and 3 who are going to lose their farms. INDOT gives them money for that land, but there's nowhere for them to go farm anywhere else.
This rural area, it can't be replaced. You know, the people that live there value the bucolic feel of this area. The Indian Creek region is just a lovely natural setting that will be transformed into a major interstate thoroughfare going through people's backyards.
Well, when we bought the property, and as we've lived here over these last 16 years, we felt like this would be the kind of property we wouldn't mind retiring on.
I've poured years into a perennial garden. We've done plantings. They're things that, especially when you reach our age, you begin to think, you've only have so many opportunities in your life where you can redo those kinds of things again.
Our barn burned about a month ago, and do we rebuild? And if so, where do we rebuild? It makes you question every significant move you might consider.
Until we have that finite plan defined through the environmental study and Federal Highway signs off, gives their approval and says, met all the guidelines, we approve this, until we get that blessing from the Federal Highway, we really can't for certain tell a property owner this is exactly what's going to happen.
It's real easy for me to sit here and say I'm for I-69 because it's not going through my family farm. It's not going through my family house. We try to work for the masses, and sometimes some of the folks get run over in the masses. And unfortunately, if you're in the pathway, the highway, it's going to take your house, it's going to take your family farm. That's very tough.
Interstates are significantly safer than certainly rural roads or any two-lane road. All you got to do to get a feel for I-69 is to drive, say, from Bloomington to Evansville. There's probably half a dozen different routes. Each one is primarily on a two-lane road. Each has lots of stop signs, goes through towns, a significant impact on both time and safety. Almost any interstate that's well designed, especially over new terrain, can have the highest standards and not be constrained by the layout of maybe a 50-year-old highway.
In general, truckers like to run interstate highways. They're safer, they can cruise, they get better mileage. And trust me, if you build the interstate highway, the trucks will run on the interstate.
Safety is primarily influenced by the amount of traffic and the speed of the traffic and the amount of time exposed. Running an interstate highway through already uncongested areas, you're going to increase traffic, you're going to increase speeds. There's plenty of evidence that shows that once you run an interstate highway through an area and people are using it and then getting off on other roads, that there's a carryover effect of higher speeds.
By building this interstate, it is a limited access facility, and what that means is we're limiting the locations where traffic can come from outside areas.
One of the really important aspects for Indiana, in addition to issues of safety and time, is the connection to Crane. Crane is a big employer. It's high-tech, relatively high-paid, high education. If Crane should downsize or close, that is going to be an absolute devastating impact on that whole area.
With Crane, it is going to help them immensely. They continue to expand, and they have so many different goods to get in and out of that area. There's more than 5,000 people between Crane employees, subcontractors, and businesses in the industrial park. There's not an overly safe route for them to get there. They're traveling on a lot of narrow two-lane roadways. So this will help enhance the travel just of the employees themselves.
Building an international superhighway truck corridor literally right at Crane's front gate actually diminishes the security of the base, the asset of isolation that makes a base like that in this part of the country, in the eastern part of the country, extremely valuable. Major moves was the long-term lease of the Northern Indiana Toll Road to a private firm. The idea was then to take that money and use it to do things like build I-69. When that was done, there was a chunk of change of about $700 million, I believe, that was specifically committed to starting I-69 at the southern end.
Securing the amount of dollars that are needed to build a project of this size is hard, because when you attack a project like this, you want it to be a viable corridor. You want it to be something that's utilized immediately when construction's complete. We were just blessed with the whole Major Moves program. $3.85 billion from the lease of the toll road of Northern Indiana that was provided to not only the Indiana Department of Transportation for our projects, but many dollars went to local cities, towns, and counties to help them also refurbish their transportation system as well.
That doesn't and hasn't and won't get I-69 very far. That money will build it at best a fifth of the way. And what then? There's no identified funding. There's no more Major Moves money coming. We'd have no more toll roads to sell. The idea of committing Major Moves money to start I-69 with no identified means of actually building the road seems to me to be just insanely irresponsible and just as bad an example of public policy as I can think of.
Governor Daniels has been very, very aggressive with I-69. Whenever he leased out the toll road for 75 years, I questioned that decision. But what it did was it gave us quick, readily available cash at hand to be able to build and do some of these things that he is working on. Without doing that project, we would not have had the $3 billion worth of cash to work with. You need to invest in yourself to improve yourself.
INDOT has to follow a certain process to get the project approved for federal funding. One of those is public input meetings, public hearings.
We've not always been known as being an open agency and willing to converse about topics, and that's not true. We have always welcomed any responses from whomever might be interested in commenting and taking that and incorporating it back in the final design plans.
The meetings, if you've gone to them, are very tightly regulated. And they get up and they have their say first, and then the public officials have their say, and then the citizens have, what, 2 or 3 minutes to speak their piece. So it's the question of who is going to control the message.
Initially, INDOT was holding a whole lot of meetings, and we showed up, we brought our table, we brought our literature, we brought our petition for people to sign, and we'd have that set up. After Mitch Daniels became governor, that started to change.
We were told that we would no longer be allowed to set up our information table. The state said it was going to be a threat to public movement.
A couple of months later, there was a meeting down in Oakland City, and they refused to allow us to have our table. Thomas was told to leave, and they fabricated this quote-unquote new meeting policy, which was really, I mean, it was unconstitutional. They said people couldn't even pass out petitions or flyers or anything at the meeting.
The state tried to say this is not a public meeting because it's not in a public space, and it's sponsored by INDOT.
Some people and some other organizations passed a law that required INDOT to allow citizens to speak whenever they are holding a public meeting. So they couldn't get away with this sham of calling a public meeting and using it as a big advertising campaign for their project.
We do not forbid any information being withheld. With several of our public informational meetings, we provided a booth type location, a table and chairs for the opposition. You can sign up to speak whether you are for or against the proposed project. In Section 3 alone, there are 5 instances where feedback from property owners and local leaders, we've actually changed the location slightly of an interchange so it wasn't negatively impacting a local business. Those things are critical, and we can't stress enough that it is imperative that the local community comes out and gives us those feedback.
I don't think there has been, certainly not in recent history, opposition to a project like there is to this anywhere in the state. And INDOT essentially is ignoring it. It's a politically driven project. It's not driven by any kind of economic need or necessity.
The opposition is widespread. It crosses all political, religious, economic castes, in southern Indiana.
The council has always been strongly opposed. I69 is always a very prominent issue discussed during the elections, and I69 opposition candidates are continually reelected.
Carr has been not only opposing I69, Carr, I think, has also been helping to spread the word about the notion of what quality of life means in communities. We would share with people what we have learned thus far and then ask them if they had questions. INDOT was not giving out maps. I would pull up to a house, show them a map, and watch people start to sob.
There seems to be a vocal minority that's very passionate, makes good arguments, but I think the majority of people statewide want the road, but most people are sort of passive about it. There certainly were alternative routes that were proposed. I think all the independent analysis really came to roughly the same conclusion, that there ought to be a direct route between Evansville and Bloomington that certainly has a connection to Crane. Where exactly it ought to be located, plus or minus 5 miles, it should be based on both costs of construction, impacts on communities, and environmental concerns.
When the state did its study, they studied 3 routes. And the 3C route, which is the one they chose, was in fact, of the 3 routes, the worst, the most costly, both in terms of dollars as well as environmentally. And that's one we believe they always wanted anyway.
Using existing roadways through Terre Haute, going over on I-70 and then dropping down US 41 would only be approximately 10 minutes longer by INDOT's own estimates.
Taking Interstate 70 from Indianapolis to Terre Haute and taking 41 to Evansville is not feasible. It's too far out of the way. And truckers or anybody using fuel is not going to do that. The Interstate 69 expansion, it could affect us in several ways. The most direct way that I know for certain is that it would eliminate a lot of our miles on 2-lane roads between Bloomington and Evansville area.
41 and 70, that was a big push because it's an existing roadway. The studies were coming back showing that it was not really going to save much time and it really was going to then put negative impact environmentally along those corridors. The corridors now are not able to handle the amount of traffic that they have, and even by expanding them by 2 additional lanes was not going to be able to help the situation. It wasn't going to give that connectivity from the northeast corner of the state to the southwest corner, which is what we were looking for. It wasn't going to give you that safety guard like the interstate will, with having less number of entrances and exits off the highway.
We could be fixing bridges, fixing roads. So every day that this project continues is another day where other projects around the state are being taken away from. The sad part of it is it's taken a priority that should be on other projects.
This is a huge expenditure of transportation dollars going into old school technology. We're wanting to look into new infrastructure alternatives such as mass transit, using rail, getting away from the single occupancy vehicle that is like the main mode of transportation in America.
The railroads are very efficient about moving large bulk shipments from point A to point B. But once you get to that point B, if you're not going to take it right there, it's got to go on a truck.
High-speed rail was also studied, and there was not a lot of feedback from the locals or interest that was expressed for a high rail transportation system from southwestern Indiana to even Indianapolis.
I would love to see railroads come back, I really would. I think that's the best mode of transportation for our freight. But the problem with railroads that we have in America is we are so spoiled in a corporation or a store or someplace. We pick up the telephone and we say, hey, I want 100 gallons of paint and I need it by Friday morning. In North America, you're not able to do that with the train system. They're not able to compete with the trucks. I'd love to see mass transportation come to North America. But when you build it here, not very many people ride it. You go broke. You go broke because the culture does not embrace that type of transportation.
In the Eisenhower administration, a decision was made to develop an interstate highway system. That was essentially the end of railroads as a method of short distance transportation of goods, and it was essentially the end of railroads as a significant passenger method of transportation. Well, now we're in the 21st century. Maybe we ought to be investing in greener, more energy efficient methods of transportation. And I think that's a fair discussion. That has to be done in a comprehensive way, not at the excuse of just looking at I69. We are committed for years and years for vehicle transportation using diesel and oil. That's the way the future is going to be for the next 20, 30 years at least. Let's complete I69 and at the same time look at more comprehensive transportation systems for the country.
For me, starting out with the public hearings in the early 90s and hearing people say, you'll never see I-69 in your lifetime, I really thought that I-69 would not be something that I would ever drive upon in southwestern Indiana.
Depending on who I talk to, it can be, in a few years, it can be another decade, it can never happen. So it's changed so much over time that it just gets kind of bothersome to have to worry about it all the time.
30 years from now, when we're still paying off debt service on construction of a massive project like this, are we really going to be trucking cheap goods from Mexico? And what a tragedy to take billions of dollars that we could now invest in a more sustainable transportation that we're likely to be depending on in the future and put it into a massively expensive interstate superhighway that may well be obsolete very soon.
If anything, the positives that comes out of this is hard times can breed good things. In other words, the sense of community. It certainly has changed things in this area. I've gotten to know a lot of people through this issue. It's heightened our awareness too of like, why do we value this place? Why do we value this area?
We've met hundreds of people, probably thousands of people at all these meetings. And these are people who truly, truly care about their communities, about what's happening to our society, about the environment. Those are people who care and are active and want to help and do something. And we think that that is really encouraging and hopeful.
My gut says that the cost of the highway is going to continue to be so prohibitive that it might never get built.
The goal, for I-69 is for us to be driving on it during 2012. That's very aggressive. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it will be a tremendous achievement if we are actually driving on Interstate I-69 in 2012 here in Washington, Indiana, and I hope we do.
And we want to get this road built as quick as we can so we can start helping the transportation industry and moving the goods. In some phases, we are still in the early preliminary design phase. Sections 5 and 6 from Bloomington to Indianapolis, we're still in the very early stages of design concept. Thankfully, because of major moves funding the construction of I69, sections 1, 2, and 3 from Evansville to Crane, that put our development process in high gear. We will have all 3 sections, so from I-64 to US 231 State Road 58, we will have those lanes constructed and traffic traveling on them by the end of 2012.
To some extent, it'll be up to who the new governor is in terms of his or her support for I-69, but I think we've gotten to the point of no return, and I-69 will be completed.
I think we're at a point where it would just be nice to have a final solution. In other words, if it's going to be built, then we'd rather it get done and be done with it. If it's not going to be built, then we'd rather know that as well. It's the not knowing that's probably the hardest thing.